The morning Emmett Talbot rode into Caldwell, Kansas, in the autumn of 1882, he had not made a single decision in 14 months that he believed in fully, and the weight of that particular failure had settled into his bones the way cold settles into old timber, quietly, thoroughly, and without any promise of leaving. He was 31 years old, broad through the shoulders, lean through everything else, with hands that bore the calluses of honest work and eyes the color of creek water in November. He had come to Caldwell not because he wanted to, but because wanting things had gotten him into trouble before, and he had learned, at considerable cost, to let necessity drive him rather than desire. Necessity said the cattle market in Caldwell was the best in southern Kansas. Necessity said he needed cash before winter closed the trails. Desire had said, 2 seasons ago, that the land north of his property would turn a profit if he bought it and ran twice as many head across it. Desire had been catastrophically wrong. The bad season had not been dramatic in the way that bad seasons in stories always seem to be. There had been no single catastrophe, no lightning strike on a barn full of hay, no flood that wiped out a season's worth of work in a single terrible night. Instead, it had been a slow, grinding accumulation of smaller failures, each one modest enough to survive on its own but collectively devastating. The spring grass had come up thin and pale, not enough to carry the expanded herd through to summer. He had bought supplemental feed at inflated prices, borrowing against the following autumn's cattle sale. The summer had turned dry and mean, and 40 head had died along a waterless stretch of range that, the previous year, had been green and reliable. The cattle that survived came to market undersized and underpriced. The loan he had taken from Harland Briggs at the Territorial Bank in Wichita had come due in February, and he had met it only by selling the northern parcel, at a loss, of course, because land sold in desperation is never sold at a fair price. He had lost 20% of his net worth in a single season, because he had trusted his own judgment about land and grass and water and weather, and he had been wrong about all of it. So now he came to Caldwell with a modest herd, one hired hand named Cody Marsh who was 18 and raw-boned and had more enthusiasm than experience, and a determination not to think too hard about anything. He would sell the cattle. He would pay his remaining obligations. He would ride back to his ranch outside of Medicine Lodge, and he would spend the winter being careful. That was the entire plan. Careful. Not bold, not ambitious, not trusting any instinct that told him one particular thing was better than another. He had discovered that his instincts were expensive. The cattle market at Caldwell was held in a dusty yard at the south end of town, just north of the territorial boundary with Indian Territory. The town itself had the particular energy of a place caught between wildness and respectability saloons, and a newly built church on the same block, cowboys fresh off the trail sharing boardwalk space with merchants and their wives, the smell of cattle and cookfires and fresh lumber all tangled together in the October air. Emmett had been to Caldwell twice before and found it tolerable, which was about as enthusiastic as he got about towns. He penned the herd, left Cody to watch them, and walked the length of the main street toward the larger of the 2 general stores, where he needed to price feed and salt block before the market opened the next morning. There was a part of him that acknowledged, in a distant and clinical way, that he was lonely. He lived alone on the Medicine Lodge ranch. He had a cook who came 3 days a week, a woman named Mrs. Prout who was 60 and uninterested in conversation, and he had Cody during working hours, and he had the horses and the dogs and the particular company of open country. He did not think about being lonely very often because thinking about it did not help, and he had enough to carry already. The market at Caldwell happened once a month in autumn, and on market morning the main street transformed. Farmers and ranchers came in from a 50-mile radius. Women came to do their town shopping. The 2 dry goods stores and the general store put out their best displays. There were produce sellers and a man who repaired saddles and harness, and usually someone selling patent medicines from a painted wagon who Emmett gave wide berth to, because he had bought one of those bottles once, and it had tasted like turpentine and done nothing useful. He moved through the crowd with his hat pulled low and his purpose clear: feed prices, salt block, and then a meal at the eating house before the early night he planned. He was standing at the long counter of Walsh's general store, waiting for old man Walsh to finish with the customer ahead of him, when he heard her. The voice was clear and unhurried, and carried the kind of authority that does not come from loudness but from certainty. She was standing at the dry goods section, which was separated from the hardware section by a low partition topped with bolts of fabric, and she was speaking to a younger woman who appeared to be her friend. "Buy the blue wool," she said. "It is heavier than it looks and it will last you 2 full winters. The gray one is cheaper, but it will go thin by spring and you will be cold and sorry." That was all. Buy the blue wool. It is heavier than it looks. Emmett did not know why it struck him the way it did. It was such a small thing, a woman advising her friend on fabric at a general store counter. People dispensed such advice 100 times a day in places like this. But there was something in the way she said it, the complete and uncomplicated confidence of it, the way the words landed without any of the hedging and qualification that had come to characterize his own thoughts about everything since the bad season. She knew something, and she said it as though knowing things and saying them was the most natural process in the world. He had forgotten what that felt like. He had forgotten what it felt like to be sure. He looked over the partition. She was not what he expected, which was foolish because he had not had any expectation at all. She was perhaps 25 or 26, with dark hair pinned up under a practical hat, and a face that was not so much conventionally pretty as it was animated and interesting. There was intelligence in it, and humor, and something that he would later spend considerable time trying to name. She wore a blue dress herself, a working dress, practical and clean, and she had a market basket over one arm and was now examining a bolt of trim with the focused attention of someone who actually knew what she was looking for. Emmett looked away. Walsh had returned and was ready to take his order, and Emmett gave it 50 pounds of mixed feed, 2 salt blocks, a box of ammunition for the Winchester, and some coffee, and he paid and arranged for the delivery to the stock pen, and he left the store and did not look back. He ate his supper at the eating house, which was run by a woman named Mrs. Hennessy and served adequate beef and very good bread, and he went to the boarding house and went to sleep, and he did not think about the woman in the general store, except that he thought about her twice before he fell asleep. Once when he was lying on his back staring at the ceiling, and once at the exact moment of sliding into sleep, that loose and unguarded moment when thoughts come without permission. He was at the cattle market by 7 the next morning. The market ran all day, with buyers coming through at intervals and deals struck on the hoof in the middle of the dusty yard. Emmett had learned enough about this process to be patient with it. He leaned against the fence with his coffee cup and watched the buyers work the pens, and he let the morning advance, and around 9 o'clock, just when the crowd around the pens was thickening with genuine activity, he became aware that someone had stopped beside him. "Those are good-looking animals," she said. "The line of the backs is consistent. You run a tidy herd." He turned. It was the woman from the general store. Up close she was even more herself than she had appeared across a partition. Her eyes were green-brown, the color of river grass in late summer. She had a light dusting of freckles across her nose that she had made no effort to conceal, which he found, in some way he could not entirely articulate, admirable. She was looking at his cattle with the frank appraisal of someone who actually knew cattle, not a polite comment from a passerby. "Thank you," he said, and he meant it because it was the truth. He did run a tidy herd, or he had before the bad season. He was rebuilding toward tidy again. "Are you selling or buying?" she asked. "Selling. You?" Looking, she glanced at him sideways, a half-smile suggesting she was aware this answer was incomplete. "My brother is hoping to expand." He asked me to come have a look at what was available before he comes in this afternoon. Your brother knows cattle, he does, and so do I. No apology in it, no false modesty, no defensive edge, just the simple fact. Emmett believed her immediately, which startled him because he had not believed anything immediately in over a year. He looked at the fence rail instead of her face. I am Emmett Talbot. My ranch is outside Medicine Lodge. Belle Walker, she said. We have a place east of Caldwell, about 12 miles. My brother is Daniel Walker. You might know him. He sold a string of horses at the Medicine Lodge fair 2 summers past. He did know the name, vaguely. The gray quarter horses. Those were his. She sounded pleased, the way someone sounds when a good thing is remembered rightly. They stood at the fence for another few minutes, and she pointed out 2 animals in the far pen that she thought looked well favored, and she was right about both of them, and Emmett said so, and she accepted this without preening about it. Then a buyer came toward them with intent in his stride, and Emmett straightened from the fence and prepared to work, and Belle Walker said, "Good luck with your sale, Mr. Talbot," and walked away toward the far end of the yard. He sold the entire herd by 2 o'clock, better price than he had expected. Not as good as 2 years ago, when he had been riding high on confidence and bad judgment, but solid and honest and enough. He stood in the market office with the bank draft in his hand and felt, for the first time in a very long time, like something had gone right. He did not attribute this feeling to Belle Walker. He attributed it to the quality of his cattle and the fair price of beef that autumn in southern Kansas. He was a practical man. He found Cody at the eating house, already halfway through a plate of food, and told him the price, and Cody whooped loud enough to turn heads, and Emmett told him to quiet down, and they ate their meal and talked about the ride home and what needed doing at the ranch before winter. And Emmett was in the process of feeling thoroughly ordinary and settled when Belle Walker walked through the door of the eating house with a man who was clearly her brother. Daniel Walker was perhaps 30, with the same green-brown eyes and dark hair, and the economical way of moving that people develop when they have spent their lives working with large animals. He acknowledged Emmett with a nod from across the room, which told Emmett that Belle had said something, and after a moment Daniel came over and introduced himself and asked directly about the herd and the price, because the cattle had already been sold, but Daniel, it turned out, was thinking about direct purchases for breeding stock in the spring rather than market animals, and he wanted to know about the bloodlines. Emmett knew his bloodlines cold. He talked about them the way some men talk about the weather, readily, comfortably, with the pleasure of a subject he understood completely. Daniel asked good questions. Belle sat at the next table and did not insert herself into the conversation, but twice, when Daniel asked something complex, Emmett saw him glance at her, and once she gave a very small nod, and once she made a slight tilting gesture with her head that seemed to mean something specific to her brother. They agreed, before the meal was finished, that Daniel would come to Medicine Lodge in the spring and look at Emmett's breeding stock with the possibility of purchasing 2 bulls and 4 heifers to start a stronger foundation for the Walker herd. It was a good agreement and both men were satisfied with it. When they were leaving, Belle stopped at his table. Daniel had already gone ahead. She said, "It was a pleasure to meet you properly, Mr. Talbot. I hope the drive home is easy." "Miss Walker," he said and stood, because his mother had raised him with certain habits that had survived everything. "Thank you for stopping at the fence this morning. It was a good conversation." She looked at him for just a moment with those rivergrass eyes, and something passed across her face that was not quite a smile but related to one, and she said, "Yes." It was, and followed her brother out into the October afternoon. Emmett sat back down and looked at his coffee cup. Cody was watching him with the undisguised speculation of an 18-year-old who had not yet learned to hide anything on his face. Emmett said, "Finish your food," and Cody grinned and looked back at his plate. The ride back to Medicine Lodge took 3 days, and the weather was cold and clear, and the trail was good, and Emmett thought about Belle Walker with a frequency that he found both unnecessary and difficult to prevent. He thought about the way she had said by the blue wool, "It is heavier than it looks," and he thought about the way she had appraised his cattle without performance or apology, and he thought about the small communication between her and her brother that was so easy and natural it was almost like watching a private language. He thought about her eyes. He thought about the freckles. He stopped thinking about those things whenever he noticed he was thinking about them, which was regular work. He arrived home, paid Cody his wages for the drive, closed out the accounts at his small desk in the ranch house, and wrote a letter to Harlan Briggs at the Territorial Bank confirming payment of the remaining balance on his loan. When the letter was sealed and set aside to go with the next post rider, he sat in the quiet of his house and felt the last of the bad season's debt release from him. And it was such a relief that he sat with it for a long time and did not try to do anything else. He wrote a letter to Daniel Walker the following week, confirming the spring arrangement and specifying which animals he thought would best suit the Walker operation based on what Daniel had told him about his grazing land and water situation. He was careful in the letter, practical, the way he was being careful and practical about everything. He did not add anything personal. He folded it and sealed it and sent it. Daniel wrote back 10 days later. The letter confirmed the spring arrangement and gave some additional details about the Walker land that were useful. At the very end, in a casual final line, he wrote, "Belle says to tell you she hopes the cattle made it home without drama." Emmett read that sentence 3 times. He did not read anything into it, because reading things into things was the kind of judgment error that had gotten him into trouble before. He wrote back a brief and businesslike reply confirming receipt and noting that the cattle were home and well. He did not mention Belle in his reply. 2 weeks later, on a gray afternoon in November when the first real cold had come down from the north, and the land had gone brown and spare, and honest the way it did this time of year, he rode into Medicine Lodge for supplies and to collect his post, and there was a letter that was not from Daniel. The handwriting on the envelope was different, smaller, more deliberate, with an unhurried neatness that suggested someone accustomed to letters and not careless about them. He did not open it in the post office. He carried it to the saddle bag and rode out of town, and along the creek road for a full mile before he stopped under a cottonwood that still had a few last yellow leaves clinging in a losing argument with November, and he opened the letter. "Dear Mr. Talbot," it began. "I hope this is not too forward. Daniel does not know I am writing, and it is not about the cattle." He became aware that he was smiling, and he stopped smiling, and then he kept reading. "I am writing because I have been thinking about the conversation at the fence during the market, and I wanted to say, you are a man who listens when someone says something worth listening to. That is rarer than it ought to be. I found the conversation worth having, and I hope you did as well. I also wanted to ask, because I have a habit of asking things directly, whether you plan to be at the December market in Caldwell. My brother will not be going. But I will, because I help Mrs. Walsh with her accounts at the end of the year and it gives me reason to be in town. If you happen to have cause to be there, I would not be sorry for the chance to talk again. Sincerely, Belle Walker." The last yellow leaf fell from the cottonwood branch above him while he was reading it the second time. He watched it drift down and settle in the dry grass at the edge of the creek, and he thought, with the entirety of his concentration, that he needed to be careful. He had not trusted his judgment in 14 months, and he was not about to start now simply because a woman he had spoken to twice had written him a letter that made him feel, against all strategic caution, like himself again. He rode home. He sat at his desk. He wrote back. "Dear Miss Walker," he wrote, "you are not too forward. I found the conversation entirely worth having. I will be in Caldwell in December for the market, as I generally am." He stopped. He looked at what he had written. He added, without planning to, "I also have a habit of saying things directly, and I will say directly that I am glad you wrote." He sealed it before he could reconsider and rode back to Medicine Lodge that same afternoon and left it with the post rider. And then he went to the supply store and bought what he had come for originally, and rode home in the dark, which he had not intended to do, and arrived back at the ranch with cold hands and the particular state of mind that does not have a clean single name but lives somewhere between hope and terror. December in southern Kansas had a way of stripping the world down to its essentials. The grass was flattened and silver. The sky was the color of old iron. The wind came off the plains without stopping for anything. Caldwell in December was a different proposition than Caldwell in October. Smaller crowd, quieter streets, the market reduced to a brief and businesslike exchange rather than the full-day affair of autumn. Emmett rode in on a Tuesday with no particular reason except the one he had, and the one he had, he was not fully admitting to himself. He found Belle Walker at Walsh's General Store at 10 in the morning, exactly where she had said she would be, bent over a ledger at the back counter with Mr. Walsh's accounts spread around her in organized rows. She looked up when the door opened, and a genuine and unguarded smile crossed her face, not a polite social smile, but the real kind, the kind that happens before a person has time to moderate it, and she said, "Mr. Talbot, you came," and somehow managed to make it sound like both a simple observation and something more than that. "I said I would," he said. "Men say many things," she replied, and went back to the column she had been adding up because she was in the middle of a sum and apparently would not lose it for manners. He liked that about her enormously. He waited at the counter, not impatiently. After 3 minutes she set the pen down with a small sound of satisfaction and turned to face him properly. "I am almost finished. An hour, perhaps less. Are you hungry? The eating house does a decent breakfast." "I have eaten," he said. "Then you will not mind watching me eat while you drink coffee." They were at the eating house by 11, and she ate efficiently, and they talked for 2 hours without running out of things to say, which was not something Emmett could have predicted, because he was not, as a general matter, a man of many words. But there was something about Belle Walker that made words come. She asked questions that were specific rather than polite, and she listened to the answers with her full attention, and when she disagreed with something she said so without aggression and with reasoning attached. They talked about cattle first, which was comfortable ground. They talked about the drought patterns in southern Kansas and what the old ranchers said about predicting them. She had opinions about well digging, and she had opinions about the new barbed wire fencing that was changing the open range, and she had opinions about the cattle markets in Wichita versus Caldwell versus the Abilene connection to the railway, and all of her opinions were informed, and she held them with conviction but not rigidity. Emmett found himself arguing with her about the barbed wire, which he distrusted on principle, and she argued back that the open range was already changing whether ranchers trusted it or not, and the argument was enjoyable in a way that arguments are only enjoyable when both parties are actually listening to each other. Then, gradually, the conversation turned. She asked about his ranch, and he described it: the creek, the south pasture where the grass grew thick, the ridge to the west that blocked the worst of the winter wind, the house he had built himself 6 years ago with 2 hired men and lumber brought up from Wichita. She asked if he had family in the area, and he said no, his family was in Missouri, and his parents were both gone, and he had a sister in St. Louis he wrote to occasionally. She asked if he had always wanted to ranch, and he said yes, from the age of 12, which had caused his father considerable frustration because his father had been a banker. "A banker's son who ranches," she said. "A rancher's sister who does accounts," he replied. She laughed, and it was the first time he had heard her laugh, and it was a good sound, easy and genuine, not the decorative kind. "Fair point," she said. He asked about her. She was 26, she told him, born in Missouri herself outside of Joplin, and she had come west with her family when she was 15, after her father had decided that Kansas land could be had cheap if you were willing to work it hard. Her father had been right about both of those things. Her mother had died of fever when Belle was 19, and since then she had run the household and kept the accounts and worked beside Daniel in everything that the ranch required. She spoke of her mother with the composed and settled grief of someone who had had years to find a shape for the loss, but there was warmth underneath it that told him the memory was a good one. "Do you like living here?" he asked. "In Kansas." She considered this with the seriousness that she seemed to bring to all questions that deserved it. "I like working here," she said. "I like the land. It is honest country. It does not pretend to be softer than it is." She looked out the eating house window at the gray December street. "Sometimes I miss trees." "There are trees along the creek at my place," he said, and then heard himself say it and wondered what he was doing. It was not an invitation to anything. It was just a statement. The cottonwoods and elms along Medicine Lodge Creek were a fact, and it was a fact worth offering to someone who missed trees. That was all. She looked at him and the corner of her mouth lifted. "That sounds nice," she said. He rode home that evening in the dark again, which was becoming a habit, and this time his hands were cold and his chest was warm, which was a different thing entirely. He had not made a decision about anything. He had not trusted any judgment. He had simply talked to a woman over coffee for 2 hours in December and learned that she liked working land and missed trees and had green-brown eyes and a laugh like something you could carry home in your pocket. He was not making any decisions. He was going to be careful. He wrote to her 4 days later. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was marked by what people in that part of Kansas would later call the Long Cold, a period of sustained freezing temperatures that settled in before Christmas and did not release until late February. Emmett dealt with it the way ranchers deal with hard winters, methodically, without dramatics, doing what needed doing every day regardless of the temperature. He kept the water troughs open with an axe every morning and threw supplemental hay to the remaining cattle, and checked the horses twice daily, and repaired a section of fence along the north boundary that the frost had heaved loose from its posts. He and Belle wrote to each other through all of it. The letters were not love letters, not precisely. They were letters between two people who were still learning the shape of each other, feeling for the edges carefully. She wrote about the cold and about her brother's ongoing struggle with a pump that kept freezing, and about a book she was reading, a history of the Kansas Territory that she had found in a box of her mother's things. He wrote about the cattle and about the fence repair, and about a young dog he had acquired from a passing family that had too many animals for the winter and needed to shed some, a brown and white cattle dog he named Creek, who was earnest and enthusiastic and not yet fully trained. She wrote back, "A dog named Creek. I like that you named him after water." He read that line several times and then wrote back, "I like that you noticed it." In February, she wrote to tell him that she had advised her brother to buy the blue wool from Walsh's store rather than the gray wool that was cheaper, and that Daniel had asked how she knew the blue was better, and she had said that someone reliable had taught her to look more closely at the thickness. Emmett understood that she was telling him something, and he wrote back carefully and honestly, "I do not know that I taught you anything at all. I think I just witnessed you knowing it already." Her reply came back in a single line at the bottom of a longer letter about the weather and the pump in Creek's training progress, which she had been following avidly through his reports. "That is perhaps the finest thing anyone has said to me in several years." He held that letter for a long time before he put it in the box where he kept the others. Daniel Walker arrived at the Medicine Lodge Ranch on a clear morning in late March, right on schedule with 2 of his men and a horse trailer to look at the breeding stock. He was exactly as Emmett had remembered from Caldwell, direct, competent, easy to do business with. They spent the morning moving through the herd and discussing bloodlines, and by early afternoon they had agreed on 2 bulls and 3 heifers, which was 1 fewer heifer than originally discussed, because on closer inspection, one of the animals Emmett had intended to sell had developed a quality he wanted to keep. Daniel did not object to this. He said it was exactly the right call and that he would have made the same one, and Emmett believed him, and the deal was done. They ate dinner at the ranch house, which was the first time in a very long time that Emmett had cooked for a guest, and the result was passable rather than remarkable, but Daniel ate it without complaint and seemed genuinely comfortable in the plain and practical space of the house. The stone fireplace, the good wooden table, the bookshelf that held an assortment of titles that revealed something about a man if you looked at them. Daniel glanced at the books without commenting, but Emmett saw him glance. After dinner, while the coffee was on and the evening was stretching quiet around them, Daniel said, with the directness that apparently ran in the family, "My sister speaks well of you." Emmett looked at his coffee cup. "She speaks well of everything worth speaking well of," he said. "It is one of the things that is easy to notice about her." Daniel looked at him for a moment, the frank and measuring look that men give each other when they are trying to determine something important. Then he said, "She has had men pursue her who were not worth her time, and she has managed them sensibly, and she has been fine. But she has not written letters to anyone the way she writes to you." Emmett said, "I know. I am not warning you off," Daniel said. "I am saying the opposite." Emmett nodded slowly. He looked at the fire. "I have not trusted my own judgment about things for some time," he said. "Not since the bad season. I made decisions that cost me considerably, and the result is that I am cautious now about trusting what I think I know." Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There is a difference between learning caution about land and weather, which are things that can surprise you, and trusting what you know about a person, which is something you learn directly." Emmett said nothing. He thought about Belle Walker at the fence saying those are good-looking animals. He thought about her at the eating house, arguing about barbed wire with a pleasure that matched his own. He thought about her letters, all of them, the whole winter's worth sitting in the box on his desk. He thought about her saying that she missed trees and him saying there were trees along the creek at his place. "She is coming with me to pick up the cattle," Daniel said, as if this were a simple logistical point. Emmett looked at him. Daniel looked back with perfect composure. "For the drive back. She knows the animals and she has a good hand with them. She often comes along for that kind of work." "Of course," Emmett said, and kept his voice completely level, which took more effort than it should have. Belle Walker arrived the next morning on a roan mare with a working saddle and a canvas bag strapped behind, dressed in the practical clothes of someone who intended to work. And the moment she rode into the yard creek, the dog ran to her, as if he had been waiting for her specifically, which was disloyal to Emmett personally, but somehow deeply appropriate. She swung down from the mare and greeted the dog by crouching to his level with complete unself-consciousness, letting him investigate her with the intense attention that dogs devote to important people. She straightened and looked at Emmett, who was standing at the corral fence. "Your dog has excellent judgment," she said. "He is unreliable about most things," Emmett said, "but I will allow he is correct about this one." She looked at him for just a moment, that particular look she had that was not quite a smile but was everything adjacent to one, and then she turned to look at the land, the south pasture. The creek lined with the cottonwoods that still bare in late March had a kind of elegant winter architecture about them. And she said, quietly, as if to herself as much as to him, "You have trees." "I told you," he said. "You did," she said, and there was something in her voice that made the simple words mean more than they said. They spent the morning working the cattle together, cutting the Walker animals from Emmett's herd with the help of Creek and Daniel's 2 cowboys, moving them into the loading pen, checking them over. Belle worked the herd with the easy competence she had promised. She had a way with the animals, a calm authority that they responded to without fuss, and watching her work was a pleasure that Emmett gave himself without apology. When she said something about an animal, it was always right. When she made a decision about the driving, Daniel followed it without argument, which told Emmett something about the years of partnership between them that was not stated in any letter. At noon he made coffee, and they ate biscuits that Mrs. Prout had left that morning perfectly timed. He noted, suspecting that Mrs. Prout had more social awareness than her conversational habits suggested, and the 4 of them, Emmett and Belle and Daniel and one of the cowmen named Horace, sat on the porch in the March sunshine and ate, and talked about the spring grass coming in, and the price of cattle and the railroad spur that was rumored to be coming to Medicine Lodge, which would change everything about the cattle business in this part of Kansas if it happened. "Do you think it will come?" Belle asked Emmett directly. He looked at her. He thought about his general policy of not trusting his own judgment. But this was not a judgment about land or weather. This was a judgment about the economics of a cattle town and its relationship to the railway interests, and it was a subject he had read about and thought about carefully. He said, "Yes, I think it will come in the next 5 years. The cattle numbers in this part of the state have been growing steadily despite the last 2 bad seasons, and the economics are there. It will change the market significantly." Belle nodded. "I think so too," she said. "Daniel does not believe it." Daniel said, "I believe it is possible. I do not believe it is certain." "That is what you always say," Belle replied, with the affectionate exasperation of a long familiarity. Emmett watched this exchange and felt, with sudden and complete clarity, that he was witnessing the kind of life he wanted. Not the particular content of it, not the specific form, but the quality of it. The ease, the warmth, the way of being known by someone well enough that they could disagree with you about a railroad spur with full affection in their voice. He looked at Belle and she looked at him, a glance that lasted only a moment, and he thought she might have seen something of what he was thinking, because the color in her cheeks shifted slightly and she looked down at her coffee cup. After the cattle were loaded and the Walkers prepared to go, Daniel shook Emmett's hand and said something quiet about the summer pasture access they had discussed, and Emmett said yes and meant it, and Horace and the other cowmen climbed onto the wagon. Belle was tightening the cinch on her mare's saddle, her back to everyone, and Emmett came around to where she was working and said, "Miss Walker." She turned. She was very close because the space beside the mare was not large. "I have been wanting to say something," he said, "and I have been finding reasons not to say it, and I have decided that finding reasons not to say things is not actually the same as good judgment. It is just a different kind of mistake." She waited, very still, with an attention that felt like the whole morning had gone quiet. "I would like to call on you," he said, "properly, with your brother's knowledge and your willingness. I would like to come to your place and spend time with you and know you better than I can know you in letters. Though the letters have been the best part of this winter." Belle looked at him for a long moment. The roan mare shifted and settled. Creek sat down in the dust 10 feet away as if he had been placed there for the purpose of watching. Belle said, "I wrote to you in December because I was afraid that if I did not, the conversation at the fence would be all there was, and that seemed wasteful of something good." "It seemed that way to me too," he said. "Then yes," she said. "Come and call on me. You will find that I am the same person in letters as in person, which is either reassuring or disappointing depending on what you were expecting." "I was expecting exactly that," he said. "It is not disappointing." She mounted the mare with a single easy movement and settled in the saddle and looked down at him, and the March sun was behind her and her dark hair was coming loose from its pin on one side, and she said, "I will tell Daniel. He will pretend he had no idea." She raised an eyebrow. "He had every idea." Emmett laughed. It was the first time he had laughed, really laughed, in a considerable while, and it surprised him slightly. And Belle looked at him when he laughed with an expression that he could not name but would spend a very long time being grateful for. He rode out to the Walker place 2 weeks later on a Saturday, having written ahead to confirm, and having spent an unreasonable amount of time thinking about what to bring, which he resolved by bringing nothing, because he was not a man who brought things, and arriving with something he had clearly deliberated over seemed worse than arriving as himself. He arrived at 10 in the morning, which was the time he had said, and Belle was on the porch when he rode in, sitting in a chair with a book open on her knee, and she closed it without marking her place, which he noticed and stood up and said, "Right on time." "I said 10, he said. "Many people say times they do not keep," she said. "I noted that you are not one of them." The day that followed was one of those days that does not have a climax or a dramatic turn, but that you understand, even while you are living it, will remain with you completely and with great accuracy. They walked the Walker land, because she wanted to show him the south pasture, where the grass was just beginning to come up green, and the creek bottom where Daniel was planning a new section of fence. She told him about the history of the land, her father's original claim, the hard first years, the gradual building up of the herd, the one winter that had nearly ended everything but had not. She was not performing these stories. She was sharing them the way you share things with someone you are deciding to trust. He told her about his own history in return, the Missouri childhood, the decision at 12 that was met with his father's deep skepticism, the move west at 22 with almost no money and a very clear idea of what he wanted, the building of the ranch, the years of solid work, the bad season and what it had cost him and what it had taught him. He told her about the 14 months of not trusting his own judgment, which he had not spoken about directly to anyone, and she listened without rushing toward reassurance, which was exactly right. "What does it feel like?" she asked. "Not trusting yourself." He considered. They were standing at the edge of the creek looking at the water. "Like every decision has to be approved by someone else before I will believe in it," he said. "Like I am waiting to be told what I know is correct before I will act on it. It is exhausting and also it makes you slow in ways that cost you." She nodded. She looked at the water. "I think you are more trustworthy than you believe yourself to be right now," she said. He looked at her sideways. "That is generous." "It is observational," she said. "The cattle you run, the way you have rebuilt after a hard loss, the way you listen to people, these are not the signs of a man whose judgment is broken. They are the signs of a man who learned from a hard lesson and is perhaps overcorrecting." Emmett was quiet for a long moment. The creek ran its particular sound over the small stones. A red-tailed hawk circled high above the south field. He said, "That is the most useful thing anyone has said to me about it." "I told you I say things directly," she said. "You did," he said. "I believed you immediately." She looked up at him then, and there was something open in her face that had not been quite this open before, a lowering of the last remaining careful distance, and he thought that he was standing at the edge of something, and for once in 14 months, he did not doubt what it was or what he wanted to do about it. He did not rush it. He came back the following Saturday and the one after that. Daniel was present on the first visit and absent on the second, though his absence was arranged with such obvious intention that it functioned almost as an announcement. Emmett and Belle walked and talked and worked side by side on the practical tasks of a working ranch. There was always something to do, always a fence to check, or an animal to look at, or a length of pasture to assess. And the work was companionable in the deepest sense of the word, two people whose ways of working were naturally compatible without effort. In April, she came to Medicine Lodge with Daniel for a supply run, and she asked to see the ranch again, properly this time. And he rode with her along the creek on a morning when the cottonwoods were putting out their first pale leaves, and the creek was running full and cold with the snowmelt from the north. She rode beside him, and she was quiet in the way she sometimes was, not an uncomfortable quiet, but a full one, the silence of someone taking something in. At the bend in the creek where the big cottonwood had come down in the winter storm and was lying half in the water with its roots in the air, she stopped her horse. She looked at the fallen tree for a long moment. "That is quite a sight," she said. "It came down in January," he said. "I meant to have it cleared, but I could not. I kept leaving it." "Because," he thought about it honestly, "because it did not look wrong," he said. "The way it fell, the way the roots are up. It looks like something that happened the way it was meant to happen." Belle looked at him with an expression of such warmth and such open regard that he felt it like a physical thing. She said, "Emmett." He had been thinking about the fallen tree, and then he heard her say his name, his first name, which she had not done before, and he looked at her fully, and she said, "I think I am in love with you." I want to be honest about that because I believe in being honest about things, And also because I think you have been waiting to be sure about something for a long time, and I do not want you to wait about this if you are already sure." The creek ran. The pale cottonwood leaves moved in the spring air. Emmett's horse turned its head slightly, interested in the fallen tree. Emmett looked at Belle Walker on her roan mare in the April morning with the creek light on her face, and he felt something shift and settle in him that had been unsettled for 14 months and maybe longer, and he said, "I am already sure. I have been sure since December, and I have been telling myself that being sure was the problem." "It is not the problem," she said. "No," he said. "It is not." He reached across the space between the horses and took her hand, which was right there, waiting, and she held his hand with a firm and immediate grip. And they sat like that for a moment at the bend in the creek with the fallen cottonwood and the spring light, and it was one of those moments that asks nothing of you except to be completely present in it. He spoke to Daniel that evening, man to man, the direct and traditional way, and Daniel listened and said, "I know. She told me 3 days ago," and extended his hand to shake, and that was that. Emmett proposed to Belle on a Thursday in May, in the south pasture of his ranch, which was a place he had chosen because the grass was at its best in May, and because it was, in his entirely personal estimation, the most beautiful part of the land he owned. He had no ring yet, which he said plainly. He intended to go to Wichita for a ring, and he would have one by the end of the month, but he could not wait until the end of the month to ask the question, and he thought she would understand that. She said yes before he had finished the sentence. She said it with a clear and simple certainty that matched exactly the way she said everything that she was certain about, which was the way she had said buy the blue wool at a market counter in October of 1882, and made him trust her immediately. And that trust had been, he now knew with absolute conviction, the best piece of judgment he had exercised since before the bad season, possibly the best piece of judgment he had ever exercised in his life. He kissed her in the south pasture in May with the grass high around them, and the sky fully committed to being blue, and she kissed him back with the same directness and warmth that she brought to everything, and Creek the dog circled them with what Emmett could only describe as satisfied energy, and then lay down in the grass and put his head on his paws and looked at something in the distance, which was gracious of him. They were married in July of 1883 at the small Methodist church in Medicine Lodge, which was not a church Emmett attended with any regularity, but which seemed the right place for the particular ceremony. Daniel gave Belle away, which they had discussed, and which Belle had accepted with a warmth that made it clear the gesture was not a matter of formality, but of genuine feeling for her brother. Mrs. Prout, Emmett's cook, came to the wedding and sat in the third row and did not cry but came close, which was as demonstrative as she was known to be. There were perhaps 40 people in attendance, neighbors, hands from both ranches, some of the merchants from Medicine Lodge who had dealings with both families, Cody Marsh in a borrowed coat that was too large in the shoulders. Belle wore a cream-colored dress that she had made herself with blue trim, which Emmett noticed was the blue wool that she had advised her friend to buy at the October market, and he mentioned this to her quietly before they went into the church, and she looked at him with those green-brown eyes and said, "Of course it is." They spoke their vows in the straight-backed and unhurried way of two people who had already had the real conversation and were now doing the formal part, and when the minister asked if he took Belle Walker as his wife, Emmett said "I do" with a conviction that he recognized clearly and without any doubt at all, and when Belle said the same, she said it the way she said everything important, directly, and with her full self behind it. The reception was at the Walker Ranch because it was larger, and Mrs. Walsh from the general store brought a cake, and there was a fiddle player and some dancing on the flat ground behind the house, and Emmett danced with his wife in the July evening under a sky that was going rose and gold at the edges, and she danced with her head tilted back slightly, laughing at something he had said, and he thought that he would try very hard to spend the rest of his life making her laugh like that. They drove back to the Medicine Lodge ranch that night, the two of them, with Belle's belongings loaded in the wagon and Creek running alongside with his ears up and his purpose clear. And when they arrived at the ranch house, Emmett helped Belle down from the wagon, and she stood in the yard in the dark and looked at the house and looked at the creek and looked at him, and she said, "Home." He said, "Home." She walked inside and he followed, and that was the beginning of the life they made. The autumn of 1883 was a good season. The grass had come up strong and the cattle were fat and the price at market was fair, and Emmett went to Caldwell in October again, this time with Belle beside him, and stood at the fence of the cattle yard where he had first heard her voice saying, "By the blue wool," and he told her about that moment, how it had struck him, what it had done to him. She listened to the whole story with great attention, and at the end she said, "I did not know you heard that. I did not know it mattered at the time," he said. "It just settled in me." She took his hand at the fence rail, right there in the open market with people moving around them and cattle in the pens and the whole loud business of a cattle market going on, and she held it, and she said, "I am glad you came to Caldwell." "I am glad about the blue wool," he said. She laughed, and it echoed across the market yard, and a man nearby looked over at them with the confused expression of someone who had missed the joke, and Emmett didn't mind at all. Their first winter as a married couple was easier than the previous one, not because the winter was milder. It was not. The cold came down hard in December and stayed, but because the house was different with two people in it, and different in ways that Emmett had not known to anticipate. There was warmth in it that was not entirely attributable to the fireplace. There were books on the shelf that had not been there before, and a blue and green quilt on the bed that Belle had brought from the Walker place, and which was, she said, her mother's pattern. There were conversations in the evening that ran long and went into territory he had not explored with another person before, not just the practical conversations about the ranch and the cattle and the accounts, which were daily and necessary, but the other kind, the ones that did not have a purpose except the knowing. He told her things he had not told other people. He told her about the bad season in more detail than he had told anyone, the specific decisions, the specific errors, the particular combination of overconfidence and bad luck that had made it so costly. She listened without judgment and without the false comfort that would have been worse than silence, and at the end she said, "You learned everything you could have learned from that. There is nothing left in it to fear." He believed her. That was the remarkable thing, he believed her immediately, the way he had believed her about the blue wool, and for the same reason, which was that she was not saying it to make him feel better. She was saying it because she had thought about it carefully, and it was what she knew. His trust in his own judgment returned that winter, not all at once but steadily, the way the light returns in February slowly and then convincingly. He made decisions about the ranch without the internal hesitation that had plagued him since the bad season, and the decisions were good ones, and he understood that they had always been in him waiting, and that what Belle had given him was not new judgment, but permission to trust the judgment he already had. Daniel Walker came for supper twice that winter and seemed genuinely pleased by the state of things. He and Belle talked about the Walker Ranch and the plan for the next year's herd expansion, and Daniel addressed these conversations to Emmett as readily as to Belle, which meant he had accepted the partnership of the new arrangement completely. Emmett found he liked Daniel enormously, liked his directness and his competence and his particular brand of bone-dry humor that surfaced only in specific conditions, like the way certain wildflowers bloom only after rain. In the spring of 1884, Belle told him she was expecting their first child. She told him at breakfast on a Tuesday morning, matter-of-factly over coffee, the way she told him things. He looked at her across the table and she looked at him, and then he stood up and came around the table and she stood up, and he held her for a long time, longer than was entirely dignified for a man who considered himself practical, and she held him back, and neither of them said anything, and it was completely sufficient. The pregnancy was not easy. She was ill through much of the first months in a way that she endured with characteristic resolution, and without complaint, though he saw the effort it cost her, and he cooked badly but with intent and brought her tea in the morning before she was up, which was the best he could do, and she seemed to find it adequate. By summer she was better, and she continued to work the ranch with modifications that she negotiated firmly with him. She would not ride fence on her own, she would not lift the heavy feed bags, but she would continue to do the accounts and help with the lighter cattle work, and do everything else she had always done, and he agreed because arguing with her about it would have been both futile and wrong. Their son was born in November of 1884, on a cold morning when the first snow of the season was coming down in the deliberate and unhurried way of snow that intends to stay. The doctor from Medicine Lodge came in time, which was fortunate, and by mid-morning there was a boy in the world who was red-faced and indignant about it and had Belle's coloring, and what appeared to be Emmett's unfortunate disposition toward scowling when uncertain. Belle held him and looked at Emmett and said, "He looks exactly like you." "He looks like he is reconsidering the whole arrangement," Emmett said. Belle laughed, exhausted and radiant in equal measure, and the baby, perhaps startled by the sound, stopped scowling for a moment and looked at her with the unfocused intensity of a newborn, discovering that the world contained something worth attending to. They named him James Henry Talbot, after Emmett's father and Belle's father respectively, which was a solution that satisfied both families and did not require anyone to argue. Daniel came 3 days later and held the baby with the concentrated awkwardness of a man who has never held a baby before and is taking it very seriously, and Creek sat beneath the chair where Belle was resting and regarded the whole proceeding with proprietary calm. The ranch grew through 1885 and into 1886. Emmett extended the south pasture fencing and brought in a new bull that improved the quality of the herd noticeably in the following spring's calves. Belle took over the full accounting for both the Talbot ranch and, with Daniel's agreement, a simplified version of the Walker books as well, which she kept in perfect order and which served both families well when they applied jointly for a water rights claim in the spring of 1885, a claim they won, which gave both ranches reliable access to the creek in dry years. Cody Marsh had grown into his early 20s and was still working for Emmett, now more senior hand than enthusiastic boy, with a serious girlfriend in Medicine Lodge, named Clara, who came sometimes to Sunday dinners at the ranch, and whose courtship Emmett and Belle watched with the fond attention of people who understood what they were seeing. When Cody came to Emmett in the spring of 1886 and told him he was planning to ask Clara to marry him, Emmett gave him a raise and said, "She deserves a man with reliable income." And Cody grinned the grin of someone who was entirely happy and went off to get himself a ring from the jeweler in Wichita. The railroads came to Medicine Lodge, as Emmett had said they would, in 1886 ahead of his 5-year estimate, which Belle noted with great composure, and which Daniel acknowledged with the dignity of a man who is admitting a wrong prediction. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe spur connection changed the cattle market as predicted, making it possible to ship cattle to the Chicago processing houses without the long trail drives, and the economics of ranching in southern Kansas shifted accordingly. Emmett was positioned for it. He had been thinking about it for 3 years, and his herd and his infrastructure were ready for the new system, and the first season of rail shipping went so well that he sat at the desk, with the account spread before him in the autumn of 1886 and understood, clearly and without any remaining doubt, that the damage of the bad season was fully and completely repaired, more than repaired. He was in a better position than he had been before it, because the years of careful rebuilding had produced a herd of better quality and a ranch of better management than the one he had run before on confidence alone. Belle found him at the desk late that evening and looked at the accounts over his shoulder and understood immediately what she was seeing. She put her hand on his shoulder and said nothing for a moment, and then she said, "There it is." "There it is," he said. She sat in the chair beside the desk, the one she always pulled there when they were going over things together. And James, who was nearly 2 and had recently discovered that stairs were interesting in both directions, was asleep upstairs in the way of small children who are exhausted by their own energy. Creek was on the rug near the fireplace. The November wind was at the windows in the gentlemanly way of wind that knows it is outside and you are in. Emmett looked at his wife in the lamplight, the dark hair coming down now from the day's pin, the green-brown eyes steady and warm, and he thought about October of 1882, and a woman he had not yet met saying buy the blue wool in a general store in Caldwell while he was waiting at a counter. He thought about the word immediate and what it meant, and how trust was sometimes the first and fastest thing, arriving before any reasoning could catch up to it, and how that particular speed had been, in his case, entirely correct. "I have been thinking," he said. She raised her eyebrows slightly. "I have been thinking that the north pasture, the one I sold after the bad season, is coming up for sale again. The Harmon family is moving to Colorado. The land is going on the market in the spring." She looked at him evenly. "I think we should buy it," he said. "I think the grass is reliable and the water access is good, and with the rail connection now the carrying capacity of this ranch can justify a larger herd. I think it is the right move." Belle looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the accounts. She looked at the window where the wind was doing its November work. Then she looked at him again with those eyes that had always told him the truth, and she said, "I think you are exactly right." He believed her immediately. He always did. The North Pasture purchase went through in the spring of 1887, and it was every bit as good as Emmett's judgment had said it would be. The grass came up thick and reliable, the creek access was excellent, and by the autumn of 1887, the expanded herd was performing at figures that put them in a genuinely strong position for the years ahead. Daniel Walker, inspired in part by what he had seen his brother-in-law accomplish, made his own significant herd expansion that same year and bought the parcel adjacent to the Walker eastern boundary that he had been watching for 2 years. He came to the Talbot Ranch for Thanksgiving dinner that autumn with his own news. He had met a woman named Eleanor Cross, a schoolteacher from Pratt, at a church social in Caldwell, and he was in the process of courting her with something that those who knew him could only describe as earnest determination. Eleanor came along to Thanksgiving, a tall, composed woman with an easy intelligence and an apparently complete comfort with the directness that was clearly a Walker family trait, and Belle embraced her before dinner with the genuine warmth of someone who had been hoping for exactly this and had recognized it arriving. Belle was expecting again by the new year of 1888, this time with the equanimity of a second pregnancy, the first having removed the uncertainty from the process. She was ill again for the first months, but marginally less so, and she continued her work with the systematic practicality that had characterized every other aspect of her life. James, now 3, followed his father around the ranch with the profound and focused purpose of a small person acquiring skills, and Emmett taught him the names of things with great seriousness. The names of the horses, the parts of the fence, the different kinds of grass, and what each one meant for the cattle, the way the clouds looked when weather was coming versus when it was going away. James absorbed all of it with the focused attention of someone who had inherited his mother's quality of listening. Their daughter was born in July of 1888, on a warm evening when the last light was golden over the south pasture, and the cottonwoods along the creek were heavy and green. She was calmer than James had been at her arrival, interested in the world from the first moment, looking about with dark eyes that were, Belle said, already her grandmother's eyes, her mother's mother, the woman whose memory still lived in the blue and green quilt on the bed upstairs, and in the way Belle sometimes held a book with a particular unconscious tenderness. They named her Margaret Rose, and she was called Maggie from the first day, and she had from her earliest weeks the particular quality of a person who is going to know exactly what she wants and how to get it, which delighted Emmett and did not surprise Belle in the slightest. Daniel married Eleanor Cross in September of 1888, a small and warm ceremony at the Walker Ranch with Belle standing up with Eleanor and Emmett standing with Daniel. And it was a good day, full and complete, with the tall September grass and the clear sky, and the very good feeling of watching someone you love find the happiness they had earned. Belle and Eleanor had found in each other, in the months of the courtship, the beginning of a genuine friendship, and watching them together at the wedding reception, talking with the easy comfort of women who have recognized each other as kin of the spirit, Emmett felt a fullness of gratitude that was almost too large for ordinary afternoon. He stood with Daniel while the women were together, and Daniel said, looking at Eleanor, "I did not know it would be like this." Emmett said, "No, you do not know until it is." Daniel nodded. He was quiet for a moment in the good way that Daniel was sometimes quiet. Then he said, "You trusted her very quickly." "I trusted her immediately," Emmett said. "From the first time she said something worth hearing." Daniel looked at his sister across the yard and then looked at Emmett with the quiet expression of a man who understands something completely. "She said it was the blue wool." "It was the blue wool," Emmett confirmed. Daniel shook his head slowly, the way people shake their heads at things that are both surprising and, in retrospect, inevitable. "I would not have predicted it," he said. "Neither would I," Emmett said. "That is rather the point." The years that followed were the full and layered years of a life built well. Emmett ran the Talbot Ranch with a confidence that had nothing reckless in it. It was the confidence of a man who had learned the difference between boldness that comes from not knowing what can go wrong, and boldness that comes from knowing exactly what can go wrong and preparing for it thoughtfully. The bad season had done this for him, had been, in the way of hard things, a teacher he had not wanted and could not now do without. Belle continued to keep the accounts for both ranches and eventually took on a third set of books for the Walsh General Store, because Mr. Walsh's eyesight was failing and his son, who was supposed to take over, had gone to Denver, and there was no one else in Medicine Lodge who could do the work as well. She did it with great competence and without particular fanfare, because she was not interested in fanfare, and she was paid fairly for it, which she had negotiated directly, because she was not interested in undervaluing herself either. James grew into a boy of remarkable precision and determination, with his mother's directness and his father's patience, a combination that was going to be formidable when it was fully assembled. He was riding reliably by 5, and could identify every animal in the herd by 6, and had opinions about the grass quality of different pasture sections by 7 that were, Emmett was honest enough to admit, correct often enough to take seriously. He was going to be a rancher, the way some people are going to be what they are from such an early age that the question of what else they might have been never quite arises. Maggie was different. She had the same intelligence and the same directness, but applied it to different things. She was fascinated by the schoolhouse in Medicine Lodge and by Eleanor, who had continued teaching after the marriage in the tradition of women who love their work too much to set it down for any reason. And she asked Eleanor questions that other children did not know to ask, and Eleanor answered them with the full seriousness they deserved. And there developed between them a bond of the intellectual kind that was entirely its own thing, and that both Belle and Emmett watched with great satisfaction. Creek the dog died in the autumn of 1889, which was a loss that hit Emmett harder than he expected, which told him something about how fully the dog had woven himself into the fabric of the years. James and Maggie both cried, and James, with the 7-year-old's instinct for marking things properly, insisted that Creek be buried under the fallen cottonwood at the bend in the creek, which was still there, still lying half in the water with its roots in the air, because neither Emmett nor Belle had ever been able to clear it. They buried Creek there on an October afternoon and stood together at the grave, and James said, "He was a good dog," and Belle said, "He was the best kind of dog, which is a dog who knows what matters," and Emmett thought about Creek sitting in the dust of the yard watching him and Belle at the beginning of things, and was grateful for the memory. They got a new dog in the spring, another cattle dog, brown and white like Creek had been, with the same earnest energy and less of the training. James named him Proper, which made no particular sense to anyone but James, who defended the name with such confidence that no one found cause to argue with it. Proper was inferior to Creek in most measurable ways but had a capacity for affection that was truly remarkable, and he distributed it without discrimination across the entire ranch, the people and the cattle and the horses and the chickens, and once, memorably, a skunk, which was a decision he regretted immediately, and which took 3 baths and most of a week to resolve. In 1890, a situation arose in Medicine Lodge that tested the community in ways that Emmett felt strongly about. A family named Littlebird, a man, his wife, and their 3 children had been living on a small parcel southeast of town, a Kiowa family that had been displaced from their original land when the Indian Territory boundaries shifted, and had settled on unclaimed land in Kansas in the years following. The Medicine Lodge Town Council, under pressure from a developer named Fisk who wanted to build a granary on the land, was moving to have the family removed on the grounds that they had no valid claim. Emmett went to the council meeting and spoke against the removal. He said, clearly and without apology, that the family had worked and improved the land, and that removing them for the benefit of a developer was not a thing a decent community did. He was not the only one who spoke. Belle had sent a letter to the council signed by herself and a leaner, and 3 of the other ranchers in the area came and spoke as well, including Daniel. The developer Fisk had 2 council members in his corner and the meeting was contentious, and in the end the removal did not happen, but not because the council decided to be just. It was because the county land office, when formally queried, determined that Fisk's proposed claim was itself not in order, and the whole matter collapsed on a technicality rather than on principle. It was not a full victory. But the Littlebird family remained, and they knew who had spoken for them, and the following spring Thomas Littlebird came to the Talbot Ranch with a basket of late summer corn from his wife's garden, and a handclasp for Emmett that said everything it needed to say without any words. Emmett held onto that handshake for a long time. He told Belle about it that evening and she listened, and then she said, "The right thing and the legal thing are not always the same thing, and it matters which one you choose when they diverge. You have been saying things like that to me for years," he said, "and I keep finding that you are correct." She looked at him across the supper table with the full warmth of 8 years of knowing each other, and she said, "I generally am." He laughed and she laughed, and James looked up from his supper with the interested confusion of a child who has missed the joke and suspects the adults are being ridiculous again. The 1890s brought changes to southern Kansas, the way decades tend to bring changes, some expected, some not, most of them manageable if you had built something solid to stand on while they happened. The cattle business continued its evolution under the influence of the railroads and the growing demand of the eastern cities, and Emmett's operation adapted to it the way he had learned to adapt, not by resisting change and not by chasing every new thing, but by thinking carefully about what was real and lasting and building toward that. In 1892, on the occasion of their 9th wedding anniversary, Belle gave Emmett a letter. Not a practical letter, not the kind they had always exchanged, but a different kind, a long and personal letter that began "Dear Emmett," in the same deliberate handwriting of the first letter she had sent in the December of 1882, and that told him, in the most considered and careful language she had ever used, what the years had been and what they meant to her. She told him about the particular quality of being known by him, of having a partner whose judgment she trusted entirely and who, she believed, trusted hers. She told him about the children, what they had been for her, what the family was. She told him about the trees along the creek and the fallen cottonwood and the south pasture in May and everything she had come to know as home. She told him that she had been afraid, in October of 1882, that she would live her whole life working beside her brother on good land with honest purpose, but without the particular thing she had wanted, without having a clear name for it, and that she had named it when she found it. He read the letter at the desk in the ranch house on a July evening with the window open and the summer sounds coming in. Belle was outside with the children, and he could hear Maggie's voice rising with some 6-year-old urgency and James's lower voice responding with the patience of an 8-year-old who had learned to negotiate with a determined younger sibling. Creek proper, he corrected himself, though he still sometimes thought Creek was somewhere in the yard, probably reorganizing the chickens for reasons only he understood. Emmett sat with the letter in his hands for a long time. Then he went to the window and called out to Belle, and she came across the yard in the summer evening, her face turned toward him with the particular attention she always gave him, and he said, "Come in here for a minute." And she came inside, and he said, "I need to say something, and I want to say it now because I am moved to say it, and I have learned that being moved to say something is not a reason to hesitate." She stood in the kitchen with the evening light behind her and looked at him with the slight tilt of her head that meant she was listening completely. He said, "You told me once that I was more trustworthy than I believed myself to be. You told me that the judgment was not broken, that I was overcorrecting. And you were right, as you tend to be about things like that. But what I want to say is the credit for the recovery of it, the credit for the years since, the way this ranch is, and the way we are, and the way the children are, and all of it, the credit for that does not belong only to me. It belongs to the fact that you said something at a fence in Caldwell in October of 1882, and I trusted it immediately. And then I trusted everything that followed from that. And every single time, the trust was exactly right." Belle looked at him for a long moment, and her eyes were bright in the summer evening, and she said, "Every single time." "Without exception," he said. She crossed the kitchen and put her hands on his face and kissed him with the ease and warmth of 9 years of knowing each other and wanting each other. And he held her in the kitchen of the house he had built with lumber from Wichita and the conviction of a 22-year-old who had not yet experienced failure. And outside Maggie was shouting something about Proper and the chickens again. And it was the exact noise of exactly the life he had wanted and not known how to want until it was his. He pulled back and looked at her face in his hands and said, "What is happening with Proper and the chickens?" Belle glanced toward the window with the expression of someone conducting a rapid assessment. "He is not supposed to be in the chicken yard, and Maggie is his designated enforcer, and she is failing at this task and is not happy about it. We should go and help." "In a moment," she said, and rested her head against his shoulder, and he held her in the kitchen for that moment, which was brief and complete and entirely sufficient. They went outside into the golden summer evening and sorted out the chicken situation, which required the combined authority of 2 adults, one older brother, and considerable noise. And Proper was removed from the chicken yard and informed of the rules again with the repetitive optimism that dog training requires, and Maggie expressed her views on Proper's reliability in considerable detail. And James offered a technical solution involving an improved latch that he subsequently installed the following Saturday, with a focus and competence that made Emmett stand back and watch, with the particular pride of a father watching a child become something. That evening, after supper and after the children were in bed and the house had settled into its quiet, Emmett sat on the porch and looked at the creek and the cottonwoods in the dark shape of the south pasture under the summer stars. Belle came and sat beside him, and they were quiet together for a while in the comfortable way of people for whom silence has no discomfort. After a while she said, "What are you thinking about?" he said. "October of 1882. She was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "That was a good month." "It was the month everything changed," he said. "It was the month you heard a stranger tell her friend to buy the heavier wool," Belle said, with the gentle amusement of someone who has heard this piece of the story and still finds it remarkable. It was the month I trusted something immediately, he said, after a long time of not trusting anything, and it was right. And then every trust after that was right, and that is what I was thinking about. Belle reached over in the dark and found his hand and held it, the same firm, immediate grip as the first time, at the bend in the creek on the April morning with the cottonwood leaves coming in. He held her hand back, and they sat on the porch of the house along Medicine Lodge Creek in the summer of 1892 with the stars out and the cattle in the south pasture, and the children asleep upstairs and the dog on the porch boards beside them. And the life they had made was all around them, solid and warm and entirely real. He thought about the young man he had been in October of 1882, riding into Caldwell with a modest herd, and a determination to be careful, and a loss so settled into his bones that he had stopped listening to himself entirely. He thought about what it had meant to hear a clear voice say a certain thing with complete and unhurried certainty, and to feel something stir in him that he had almost forgotten was there. He thought about standing at the fence the next morning and talking about cattle with a woman who knew what she was talking about and said so without apology, and about eating house conversations in December and letters through the winter and April mornings at the creek bend, and a proposal in the south pasture in May and a July wedding, and all the years between then and now, each one adding something, each one building on the one before. A structure of days and work and love and argument and laughter and loss and recovery that was, by any reasonable measure, the best thing he had ever built. The fallen cottonwood was still there at the bend in the creek. They had never moved it. It had been there long enough now that it was becoming part of the bank, the wood going silver, the roots settling back toward the earth, and small plants had begun to grow in the shelter of it that would not have grown there otherwise. Every time Emmett rode past it, he thought about Belle saying "you have trees," and about Creek running to her in the yard, and about the way the world had arranged itself into before and after the day a woman he had not yet met said something in a general store that mattered. 14 months of not trusting his own judgment, and then one morning in a cattle market, one voice at a fence, one conversation over coffee in December, and the trust came back better than it had been, because it had learned in the hard time to be more careful and more honest and more entirely itself. He looked at Belle in the dark, her profile against the summer sky, the easy comfort of her beside him, and he knew as completely and clearly as he had known anything that this was right, that this had always been right, that the trust he had placed that morning in October, in the voice first, then the woman, then the years, had been the truest judgment he had ever made. She turned and looked at him, sensing his attention the way she always did, and said, "What?" "Nothing," he said. "Everything." She smiled at him in the dark. "That is not particularly precise for a man who values precision." "No," he said, "it is exactly precise. Everything is the only accurate word." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and the summer night went on around them, and the creek ran its quiet, permanent sound in the dark, and the stars were out all the way to the horizon in the flat Kansas sky, and they sat together on the porch of the life they had made until the night was very late and the stars had moved a little in their courses, and then they went inside and put out the lamp, and the ranch was quiet, and the creek ran on. James Henry Talbot, in the summer of 1893, at age 8, announced to his father that he wanted to learn to read the clouds for weather, which Emmett considered one of the finest things his son had ever said, and he taught him over the course of that summer everything he knew about cloud reading, which was considerable, and by September James could predict a weather change 12 hours out with reliable accuracy. Belle added to his education the botanical knowledge that helped predict rainfall by the behavior of prairie grasses, which she had learned from years of reading, and from an old caw man named George Whitehorse, who sometimes came through Medicine Lodge in the spring, and who had a knowledge of the land that Emmett respected deeply, and Belle had made a point of learning from whenever the opportunity arose. Maggie, who was 5 in 1893, was already reading with a facility that Alina declared remarkable. And Alina was not a woman who declared things remarkable without meaning it. Maggie would sit at the kitchen table in the evenings with a book of any kind, history, story, whatever was available, and read with a focused pleasure that stilled the room around her. And Belle would watch her with an expression that Emmett recognized as the particular joy of seeing your own qualities flourishing in someone beyond yourself. Daniel and Alina's first child, a son named Samuel, was born in 1891, and the families spent enough time together that Samuel and James and Maggie had the particular closeness of cousins who have grown up knowing each other fully. The Walker and Talbot ranches had evolved, through the years of cooperation and the shared water rights and the crossbreeding of stock, into something that was not quite one operation, but was more than two separate ones. An informal partnership of families whose interests were thoroughly aligned and whose trust in each other was complete. In the autumn of 1893, Emmett stood at the Caldwell cattle market for the first time in several years. He had been sending Cody and the hands more often, as the operation had grown, and he stood at the same fence where Belle had stood beside him 11 years before. The market was bigger now than it had been in 1882, the town grown and more established, the cattle pens expanded, the buyers more numerous. Belle was not with him this time. She had stayed home with Maggie, who had a cold, and because Cody was more than capable of managing the sale. He had come along primarily because he had business at the bank in Caldwell, and because he admitted to himself with the honesty that his wife had long since made reflexive in him, because he had wanted to stand at this fence again. He stood there for a while, looking at the cattle in the pens, and he thought about everything that had grown from one October morning in this place, and he felt the solid and unshakable goodness of it. He did not stay long. He had what he had come for. He rode home in good time, arriving before dark, which was sensible, and which was also because he wanted to be home. Belle was on the porch when he rode in, with Maggie wrapped in a blanket on her lap, both of them looking at the late afternoon sky, where the clouds were doing something interesting with the last of the light. She looked up when he rode into the yard and smiled the real smile, the one that was always there before she had time to moderate it. "How was the market?" she asked. "Good," he said. "Cody did well. The prices were fair." He dismounted and came up onto the porch, and Maggie said from within her blanket, "Papa, look at the clouds." And he looked at the clouds, which were indeed remarkable. The last light was making them rose and copper and a deep impossible blue at the very top, and the whole sky was full of it, and the land below it was going gold and then brown as the light changed. "Beautiful," he said. "Mama says the copper ones mean a fair tomorrow," Maggie said. "Your mother is correct," he said. Belle looked up at him with the green-brown eyes that had been looking at him for 11 years and that still, on certain evenings, in certain lights, stopped him exactly as the first sight of them had stopped him. He sat in the empty chair beside her and looked at the sky with his family, and the sun went down in stages over the flat Kansas horizon, taking its time, spending all of it, and the evening came up blue and then purple and then full dark, and the stars appeared one by one as they always do, and the ranch settled into its nighttime sounds, and everything was exactly as it should be. He thought before he went inside about a word that he had carried for a long time. The word was trust. He had thought of it as a risky thing after the bad season, something that could be placed incorrectly and cost you. And it could be. Land could surprise you. Weather could betray you. Prices could collapse. The world had a full range of ways to disappoint a man who trusted it. But trust in a person, trust in the specific and particular fact of a woman who said what she meant and meant what she knew and knew what mattered, that was a different architecture entirely. That was not a bet against the weather. That was a foundation. He had known it immediately. He had known it at a market fence in October of 1882, before he had any reason to know it, before he had earned the knowing through time and experience. He had heard her voice and something in him had said yes, and he had doubted that yes for months, had run it through every careful filter his battered judgment could construct, and at the end of all the careful filtering the answer was still yes, and it had been yes for 11 years, and it would be yes for however many years remained to him, and this was not a matter of hope or faith or optimistic estimation. It was a matter of knowing, and he trusted his knowing. He always had. Even in the worst of the doubt, when he had told himself that his judgment was broken and his instincts were not to be trusted, even then, from the very first moment, he had trusted Belle Walker without any doubt at all. She stood up from the porch chair with Maggie still wrapped around her and said, "Come inside. It is getting cold." And he stood and held the door, and the family went in out of the autumn dark, and the lamp was lit, and the house was warm, and Emmett Talbot, who had not trusted his own judgment since the bad season and had trusted Belle Walker immediately and completely, and without reservation from the first time she said something worth hearing, came home.